Today we have Dr. Melissa McConaghy joining us. Melissa is a specialist neurophysiotherapist and is also the founder of PD Warrior and the Insight Conference. And Melissa will be talking to us about the latest in exercise research and about falls as well. So welcome, Melissa. Thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Stacey, and welcome everybody. I'm here on Camaragal land. What I'm going to do is just share my slides. So give me 1 second while I do that for you. Right, perhaps you can let me know, is that showing, Stacey?
It is, yeah.
Fantastic. So I've got about just under 20 slides. I'm going to go through some of the evidence and literature around falls prevention specifically. And then at the end of the presentation, if you've got questions, by all means, I've left a bit of time there to answer any of the questions that you might have. So I want to talk about the practical approach to falls prevention, and that covers quite a few areas and some of the evidence that we are exploring clinically to try and manage falls as well. So when we look at falls, one of the first things that we're really talking about are the contributors to falls. And this is something that we would do clinically in an assessment, is to try and address some of these key areas to understand a little bit more about why somebody has postural instability, why they might be having falls, or more importantly as well, why they might be having multiple near misses where they have, tripped or scuffed but managed to catch themselves at the last minute. And I think we often underestimate how significant those near misses can be, because they often can lead to falls, but they can also lead to lack of confidence, which then has a spiral effect if not addressed, where it can start to reduce access to the community, social participation activities, and people's universes can become a little bit smaller because of that. And then that can have a knock-on effect with overall activity levels. So this is what I will go through. All of these, well, the key areas that I'm going to go through, not all of them. Postural instability, what that means, what are the contributing factors to that, and what you might want to do about that. Vestibular dysfunction, which we often underestimate in people with Parkinson's for two reasons. One, it's not often addressed as an issue that might be leading to falls and dizziness and lack of balance. And the other area is that many people with Parkinson's, the majority of people, are in the older age group, and they often do have vestibular, peripheral vestibular issues going on as well. Third area would be freezing of gait specifically, which is a high contributor to falls. Deconditioning, which is around frailty, lack of strength, lack of endurance capacity, those sorts of things. They are known risk factors for falls as well. Cognitive decline, which is one of those factors of Parkinson's, particularly around sedentary behaviour patterns as well. And then on the slide to the right, you'll see autonomic dysfunction, which can be a primary contributor to falls. It can be related to the Parkinson's itself, but it can also be related to the medication that you might be taking. And basically, autonomic dysfunction is when you stand up, maybe your blood pressure drops, for instance, and that can make you very woozy. That's sort of what we're talking about with autonomic dysfunction, which can be a feature of Parkinson's and the medication you take. OTs will often look at the environment that you function in as well. So if you've got a home that's cluttered, you've got lots of rugs, cords, trip hazards on the floor, you've got animals that you might trip over, those sorts of things, they are certainly things that we can address as well when we're looking at falls management. And the final one is the medication that you might be on. As I said before, some of the medications that you take can also reduce your blood pressure even lower. And so that can have a big impact when you get up from it, or you change position from a lying or a sitting position, etc. So let's go through the first one, which is postural instability, and talk a little bit about that, because this is a big risk factor for falls, and it is one of the hallmark features of Parkinson's. So basically what we understand with Parkinson's in the early stages, postural instability is probably not such a big problem for people. But around the moderate stages of Parkinson's, your ability to respond to an external perturbation, somebody knocking into you, your righting reactions to that can be reduced. You might have changes in your proprioception, which is what we describe as your awareness of body in space. So, knowing where your feet are and how that correlates to where your center of gravity is. that can certainly be impaired. And so you become quite dependent on visual field. And so what is in front of you becomes a higher priority. And so where your body is in space, if you've got anything happening behind you, often that's not read, or your body mapping is incorrect. And that's what we talk about with proprioception, and that can be impaired in Parkinson's as well. And that can have a big impact on your stability and where your center of gravity is. Weight shift can be impaired as well, particularly if you feel like your feet are getting stuck to the floor. One of the problems with freezing of gait is that you'll often try to take a step, but you're still standing on the foot that you want to take the step forward with. And that can be for a couple of reasons. One is that you haven't had the motor programming to move your weight over onto the opposite leg to start with, or you might be quite deconditioned and weak in that pelvic area, and you're not able to support your body weight for extended periods on that single leg. So that the capacity and your ability to weight shift is often what we will need to look at as well, and whether there's issues there. With postural instability, dual task training is something, or the assessment of that feature would be quite a feature as well. So we'd be wanting to look at your ability to walk and talk, walk and carry an object, stand in the one spot, and pull a jumper over your head. So doing multiple things at the same time. And in Parkinson's, this can be impaired. We know that the automaticity of task function can be impaired. It doesn't mean that the motor program itself, there's anything wrong with that. But if you think about a computer, often you'll recognize there's a file, but it's your ability to get to the file, which might require a little bit of work. And so that's why we have difficulties with doing more than one thing at the same time. If you can't walk automatically with accurate distance, step width, all of those sorts of things, then you need to be thinking about those things all the time. And if you are distracted by having a conversation or carrying something, then you can't be thinking about walking and having that conversation. That's often why it's quite difficult to do more than one thing at the same time. And so certainly in physiotherapy, what we would be looking to do is to increase your automaticity of the walking in this example. And the last one there is vestibular, as I mentioned before. This is a key area that is often overlooked in Parkinson's and can make a big difference to postural stability, feeling quite centered, using your vestibular system in the right priority, not just having that visual dependence, etc. So we'll talk about all of those key areas there. Just this bit here, just looking at postural instability. What we've got here is a really challenging exercise for a gentleman. So you can see that we've got a bungee cord. If you can see the black cable on the back there, what we're doing is pulling this gentleman back all the time, which is pulling him back and putting that pressure on him. And that's creating an external perturbation, an external force that he has to kind of battle with. And because it's unpredictable, he has to learn to adapt to that. Then you can see we've got him stepping forwards and backwards against that force. So that's creating a little bit more challenge. And then there's a reduced surface area as well. So he has to be very accurate, and there's a change of amplitude of stepping as well. So you can see how in training, we're really working on proprioception, where he is in space. There's forwards and backwards. So there's that awareness of body. There's external perturbation with the bungee cord. And then, we could be asking him to name suburbs around where he's living if we really wanted to layer that up and add the complexity to the task. Now, that's a really high level activity. That's certainly not something we would do for everybody, but it's just to demonstrate how we could layer up complexity to address many of these areas here: dual tasking, weight shift, proprioception, and perturbation. And you can just see here in this example, we're really working on, again, that external perturbation wobble board, because that can be a little bit unpredictable how you have to react to the shift of weight. So there's the weight shift in there, there's proprioception, learning where your body is, where your feet are in reference to your body in space, and how your center of gravity needs to adjust to that. And then throwing that ball, you also then have to adjust and anticipate where the ball is going to be, the trajectory, how quickly can you catch that, how coordinated do your fingers need to be. So again, these are examples of high-level activity that we could layer up or layer down in complexity for each individual. All right, let's move on, if I can get my slides to work. Examples of proprioceptive training. You can see here with Christina on the left there, we're looking at what happens when her hand is out of her visual field. So you can see they're out of visual field. she's needing a little bit of visual guidance to actually get that hand all the way back. So we might provide that visual guidance, and then in order for her to internalize that, it might be, okay, can you feel the stretch through the arm? Give you enough time to stretch that out. We're looking at symmetry. Maybe we would use a mirror to kind of support that aspect as well. So you can see there that we would provide scaffolding to provide that guidance around how to achieve the task and how to learn where that limb is in space, and then ways to internalize that so you could practice that independently at home. This is another example here where this is an exercise called falling tree, which is where we get an individual to lean forward until like they feel that they cannot support their weight anymore. That's creating a lot of stretch through the calf muscles, which is giving you increased proprioception, increased awareness of where you are in space. There's little receptors on those muscles that are feeding up to the brain. And then what happens when you exceed that threshold of balance? You then have to take that step forward. Now, I wouldn't suggest you do any of these exercises without a therapist to support you, because it may or may not be appropriate, but you also need to make sure it's safe. And so in this particular setup here, we have a chair in front, but it might be that you would do this into a wall or a dining room table or a really sturdy chair or something like that, as a way of training your proprioception and your ability to take a sufficient step forward to catch yourself if you were in this position. And again, just looking at other ways of challenging your proprioception is looking up, looking down, which is really forcing you to use your visual field. Just stop that there. And really forcing you to use your proprioception where your body is. And so you can see there that that's a Dura disc, a really rubber mat. You could use pillows at home and things like that. So there's lots of ways that you could challenge those. These are all quite high level though, so I certainly wouldn't suggest you do these without physiotherapy guidance. Just some examples of what we might do to train proprioception. Sorry, my slides are slow to keep moving forward. For weight training, just an example here of how we might use dots on the floor to provide accurate foot markers. And we can see here in this example that there's a timing component that we would want to work on as well. So with some of this exercise where you're right, left, what we would be really keen to achieve is accurate foot placement first, and then consistent stepping, timing of your stepping. So what we would want to do is, instead of having what we've got here, which is 1, 2, videos are all sorry. Instead of having 1, 2, pause, 3, 4, what we would want to have is slow it down and have really consistent timing, especially with that step back, which is when you don't have that visual field, it can be very challenging to change direction. And you can imagine all the scenarios where you would need to navigate to step backwards. If you're in a shopping center and you need to move out of the way, if you're negotiating furniture in the house and you need to step around to sit on a chair or a couch. So you need to be able to have that ability to step sideways and back. And so what we might do in this exercise is 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's that 3 that's really where we would force that change and that direction change. And so that would be a key focus for someone that had proprioceptive and weight shift issues, is that multi-directional stepping, consistent timing, and making sure forcing that step backwards to the beat. So that would be a really clear example of how we might do that. Again, example of somebody doing higher level activity. We've got a harness holding this individual treadmill, but we're asking that she change direction. So to be stepping backwards for 4, stepping to the side for 4, stepping to the front for 4. And then you can hear we've created an obstacle course where there's things to step over, which might replicate more of the things that you might see out and about in the community. So again, really high level examples that are safe because we've got the harness, but extremely challenging. Oops, sorry. Other things that we might do in this example here is use blaze pods or something that light up, and you can create lots of different configurations where you have to step to the side, you have to step behind you, you have to step back, and you're constantly looking and scanning, and that again is challenging your visual field, your neck range of motion, your ability to process information, visual information around you, as well as your weight shift. And again, this is how you might look to layer up. So you might just have a half of a semicircle that you're stepping to, then you could increase it to 45 degrees behind you, and then you could do the full 360 degrees. And there's some apps out on the market. I can think of Clock Yourself, which do this just on your phone, getting you to imagine a clock face. And so they get you to step backwards to 6 o'clock or to 3 o'clock to the side. And you can layer that up with dual tasking activities as well. So this is what we would be looking to do with some of the weight shifting. I've mentioned vestibular dysfunction, and I think, again, it's often overlooked, and I think that's why it's really important that you have a therapist address any notion of dizziness or motion sensitivity or difficulties when you get out of bed and you have that change of position and you get quite woozy or quite dizzy. All of those do need to be addressed because they can have a significant impact on your falls risk and also your confidence. And I think if you don't have confidence, as I said before, your universe can become significantly smaller. So one of the ways that we might assess this, if you can see that little image on the right-hand side there, is just standing with your feet together on the floor with your eyes open. And we would just look to see how stable you are in that posture. Usually, if you can do that for 30 seconds, that's a good indicator of your postural stability. Sometimes people might get clinical measures of that where they actually look at how much your body sways, and that can be looked at as a measure of risk for falls as well. And then we might move on to vestibular and proprioceptive, where we get you to close your eyes. Sometimes we might use a mask or eye shade or something, and then look at what happens, because you've still got proprioception. You can still feel where you are in space. How do you respond to that? What's going on with your vestibular system, and how do you use both proprioceptive and vestibular systems to stay upright? How dependent on the visual field are you, is what we'd be looking at there. Then the third one, along with a tick, is where we would keep your eyes open, but we would reduce your proprioception by putting you on an unstable surface. Usually this is like a special foam mat, which makes it really hard for you to balance on that. So you can see you've got your vestibular system working for you, but you can't feel so much of where you are in space. And we'd look to see what happens then. And then the fourth one, which we would then identify specifically for vestibular, is we put you on a foam mat where you can't balance so well. It takes away some of your proprioception, and then we take away your visual field with a mask. And then we look to see how intact your vestibular system is. And that can give us lots of information around what course of treatment we might need to address. As I mentioned before, some people with Parkinson's are very sensitive to motion. You might have experienced where you've been sitting on a train and the other train moves and you can't tell for a moment whether it's the other train moving or your train's moving, and it can be really disconcerting. And that's that motion sensitivity. Or you might be in a vehicle and you get really unwell just from sitting in the vehicle. You couldn't imagine reading or doing anything. And that's a heightened sensitivity to motion, and that might be something that needs to be addressed as well, because it can really impact your ability to get out and about in the community. Another area we might look at is your ocular function. So the muscles that drive your eyeballs, they can be slow as well, much like Parkinson's, with that underscaled movement, underscaled power. That can happen in your eye muscles as well. And so your ability to shift direction and focus acutely can be impaired as well. And that can impact your ability to focus on an area quite far away and then quickly and rapidly move to something in front of you. And you can imagine if you're walking across a set of traffic lights and you've only got a short amount of time to do that, then you've got a car horn or something beeping to the side. You've got to turn your head, focus really quickly, then bring your head back and focus on where you're going. That can be disrupted if you don't have that oculomotor function intact. And so we'd want to have a look at that as well. And then, simply by virtue of degenerative neck over time, we all get a little bit rickety as we get older. That can certainly limit your ability to turn your head effectively. And then if you can't match your eyes to that, you can see how that might be a big problem. And so vestibular dysfunction really does need to be addressed in anybody that's experiencing near misses or has a history of falls. And when we say history of falls, what we're talking about is at least one fall in the previous 12 months. Because if you've had one fall in the past 12 months, that's a high predictor that you're likely to have more falls in the coming 12 months. And so if anybody on the call here has had a fall in the last 12 months, I would strongly encourage you to get that assessed by a clinician who can address many of these things that we're going through today. Okay, some of the vestibular training techniques that we might look at, again, this is a high level version, but what we're going is focusing down on the floor, whole body movement up, and then focusing on a moving target that's floating in the air above. Now, that might be way too advanced for some people, and it might need to be that we start this as a seated exercise and you're just following a floating object in front of you. So again, there's lots of ways that you would start this exercise at a level that was achievable, and then you could layer it up over time. And the thing with vestibular exercises is they can be really uncomfortable because they make you feel woozy and they make you feel dizzy, but only a little bit. And that's kind of the key. You want to feel it for a little bit, and then you want it to resolve after about 5 or 10 minutes. But they are provocative exercises, and they're meant to be. Another one over here, you can see here a figure of 8. What we'll often do in a clinical setting and then get people to do at home is using those laser pointers, and Bunnings often have them. You can get hats with laser pointers. They're used for lots of different things. And then you would be looking at a wall with a figure of 8 image on it. You could either be seated or standing, and you're just looking to match or follow and trace the figure of 8 with your head. Now, that's for cervical range of motion as well as proprioception in your neck, because if you can't feel and line up where your neck is with your eyeballs, that's going to cause big problems as well, especially if you're out in the community. So there's lots of different ways that we would target and address specific problems once we have been able to identify them. All right, so one of those other key areas that we talked about in terms of falls predictors was freezing of gait. Now, this is a big one because most people fall when they are feeling at their best because they're typically up and about doing activities and being mobile. So when you feel at your best is when you probably have the biggest risk of falls. And most people that fall in their home because that's where the volume of activity typically takes place. Most people with falls with Parkinson's will fall forward or to the side. It's not that common that people fall backwards. So if people tell me that they're falling backwards, it's usually because they've tripped on something while stepping backwards, tripped on an animal, cord, cable, something like that, or there's something else going on, and that's what we would want to address. It's really common if people have freezing of gait that they will experience some form of lack of confidence, near misses, or falls as well. And the reason for that is if your feet get stuck or you can't take that step forward, you can't stop yourself from your center of gravity coming forward over your base of support. And that's when typically if people don't have a big enough step forward to catch themselves, that's when you can get into trouble. So we often try and provoke freezing in a clinical setting, and sometimes it can be quite tricky. But it's really common that people will fall when they're turning, and I'm sure if you've experienced this, you'll be very aware of this. You'll experience freezing when you're turning, when you have a change of environment, so you're going from a lino floor onto a carpet, or you're coming up to a door frame or something like that. That's when a lot of people will experience freezing of gait. Typically, freezing responds to levodopa medication, but for some people, it may not make a difference whether you're at peak dose of medication or not. And it might be more that when you are in a really heightened level of arousal, you're in a really busy shopping center, there's a lot of noise, a lot of movement, there's a lot of things to process that can make you quite anxious. That can increase your freezing as well. And so we would want to really tease out, well, what is causing your freezing of gait? Is it a movement dysfunction and not being able to get your feet underneath your center of gravity quickly enough? Is that what the problem is? Is it you can't weight shift sufficiently? Is it that you're weak in your hips? Is it that you get highly anxious and that contributes to your feet sticking to the floor? There's lots of reasons that contribute to that. And unfortunately, as people progress through their Parkinson's, if it's not addressed in the early stages, all of those things can come together and create a lot of interference with mobility and confidence and function. So we'd like to try and address freezing of gait as early as we possibly can. But as I said, it can be quite hard to provoke in a clinical setting. Most people will walk really well on a nice flat lino surface. And so what we'll often do in a clinical setting, if you can see these examples here, is we'll create levels of provocation so that we can see, well, what is going on? Is it when you're turning? So we might get people to do a timed walk where you stand up, you walk 3 meters, you turn, and you come back and sit down. Does that cause any problems? Or is it you stand up, you walk 3 meters, and you do a full 360, and then you come back and sit down? Because turning, we know, often provokes freezing of gait. Is it that you have to walk to the same area and then walk around a box? We call it a shuttle box. Walk around a 60 centimeter box. Does that cause any problems? Or is it when we're asking you to walk through narrow gaps or do an additional dual tasking arithmetic or language task at the same time? What is it that leads to your freezing of gait? Because that's how we're best going to be able to address your freezing of gait. Other things that we might look to do as well is called a trail making test. And you can see here, if you can see these numbers, I'm just looking, my screen's so tiny, there's an A and a 1 somewhere. Where's my A? Oh yeah, here it is. Here's my A and here's my 1. So this is where we ask you to do a language task, so identify letters of the alphabet sequentially, but we interject with numbers. And so you'd go from A to 1, and then what would you need to do? You would go to B, which I'm looking for my B on my big screen. Then you've got to go up to B, and then you've got to go now down to number 2, which is down here. And so we call that set shifting, and that requires quite a lot of executive function. And so if that's quite problematic for people, they make errors or they're incredibly slow, that tells us that there's an executive cognitive component possibly leading into this freezing of gait as well. And that's what might be causing issues. And so that's where we might be drawing on our OT colleagues to support some of the cognitive processing so that we can really improve some of the freezing of gait. These are just some examples of strategy. So this is an exercise that we call penguin waddle. For obvious reasons, it looks like I'm being a bit of a penguin. What I'm doing is a pendulum motion where I'm really emphasizing my weight shift. So I'm trying not to have the legs abduct, they're fixed in distance. And then I'm transferring my from one disc to another. And you can see there's a proprioceptive component because I'm also shifting weight and turning backwards. And that itself adds some additional complexity. And then what I was showing before, as well as I'm introducing an arm exercise, which is very different to what the legs are doing, which adds the dual tasking component. So you can see here how I've layered this up. And for some people, all you might need to practice is the weight shift. And we might recommend that you do that in a corner where you get your shoulder to touch one wall and then you get your other shoulder to touch the other wall and you stay in that pendulum motion. And that might be what you practice to get your weight shift going. Another exercise might be that we need you to practice stepping over an object and then a full 180-degree turn, which is really nice controlled steps because that can be a provocation, the turning process. Instead of lots of small festering steps, we get nice, big, pronounced steps as you turn, and then a lovely big step over. And that might be what we need to practice for somebody that's got difficulty with amplitude of movement, with power, with pronounced stepping, etc. And there's some actually really lovely emerging evidence around using robotic assisted gait training devices. The reason I show this is because the evidence is quite compelling. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of these devices available, but the literature shows us if we can get 4,000, 5,000 steps in a practice, which might take around 45 to 50 minutes, of a consistent stepping length, consistent symmetry, so we're forcing that weight shift, we've got sufficient clearance of the heel, of the toes, we've got all the physiological movements of the walking down pat, and you're practicing that over and over and over and over and over, that has some really nice outcomes for freezing of gait as well, if your proprioception, weight shift are one of your primary problems. So just again to show you there's lots of different ways that we might start to target the freezing of gait based on what the literature is telling us. And then cueing. For those of you that are not familiar with cueing, one of the most common ways of teaching cueing is to use a metronome or some kind of consistent beat. That is a skill to step to a beat. For those of you that have always said you can't dance very well, it might be because it's difficult to step to a beat. And so once you've learnt to step to a beat, that can be really helpful if you do experience freezing of gait. particularly in initiation of gait, where it's hard to take that first step. And so some people will have a metronome app on their phone. They'll have some headphones in if they're out and about. And if they do experience freezing of gait, that metronome will kick in and they can listen to the beat and step and weight shift to initiate that first step. So auditory is very common, and there's lots of different intuitive devices now and intelligent devices that just turn on when you need them. And I think the key to that is it's not on all the time, so you're not habituating to that. For the drivers in the audience, you know, half the time I can't even remember how I got to work. You know, I just do it. It becomes so automatic. And I'm sure many of you often will go, well, how did I get here? I can't remember the whole journey, because you habituate. You don't see the road signs anymore. You've seen it so many times, you just don't see it anymore. Same thing happens with cueing. If it's on all the time, you don't notice it anymore. So you need it to turn on when you really need it. There's some visual stimulation as well now. So there can be laser canes that only turn on when you need it. There's agilitas, which can attach to the hip and detect with accelerometers if you start to festinate or slow down and are not taking that appropriate step forward. The light might come on. So again, there's really intelligent cueing strategies now that can be very, very helpful for people. But I would say we've tried lots of different devices on lots of different people, and it is a skill to learn to use these devices at their best. And some people, it's not really helpful at all, and others it can be amazing, but they do need quite a lot of training to use them well. Okay, moving on. Deconditioning. So as I mentioned before, deconditioning, it's not part of having Parkinson's, but it can be one of the biggest reasons why people lose function, and it can be completely independent of your Parkinson's symptoms. So what I think historically has happened is people have been diagnosed with Parkinson's. We know that, and you will know this as well, there's often a sense of grief, lack of control, not knowing what's happening in the future, and this withdrawal from social activities. It might not happen immediately. It might have been happening 2 years preceding the diagnosis. But what does typically tend to happen is people move less. And at that point of diagnosis, people can already be moving 30% less than people that don't have Parkinson's. And if you're not moving, that can lead to additional weakness and lack of endurance. And so that deconditioning then starts to have an impact on your overall level of function, independent of your Parkinson's. It's got nothing to do with your Parkinson's in that it's not your Parkinson's stopping you from moving, going out, etc. In some scenarios, it's because you're weak, you don't have the endurance, you get too tired, you don't have the strength, you don't have the power. And in physio and EP and things like that, that's kind of bread and butter to support you to be in peak physical condition so that you can deal with all of your Parkinson's symptoms and probably mitigate most of them. And so this is just an example here of what we might do for somebody that's really struggling to get out of a chair. And this can be a common problem because of lack of weakness in the muscles, in the quadriceps, the glutes. That can be problematic if you're quite weak and in an older age bracket, because what tends to happen in people over time is because they do less activity over time, generally in the normal population, your muscle fibers change as well. And what you tend to lose are those muscle fibers that generate the power that you need to get out of a chair powerfully and effectively once. So you've got lots of things going on. And it's essentially the low-hanging fruit, because these are the things that we can do lots of things with. So this is just an example of a gentleman that was really struggling to get out of a chair. And so we gave him an external reference point, which was reach for the floor, reach for the ceiling, and then sit down. Now, as I'm looking at this video now with the benefit of hindsight, it is sitting down like a sack of potatoes. And that's something that I would want to address, because you want to be sitting down in a really nice controlled fashion, because that's actually where you build most muscle, is in the stretching, that eccentric component of your exercise. So that's where you build a lot of the bulk of your muscle. And then you want the power, the fast twitch muscle fibers to get you to stand up nice and effectively, rather than have to push through your arms, do a lot of movement and swinging forward. So we might look at variations of different ways to get you up effectively and efficiently and safely as well. Another area that we will often address is getting on and off the floor. And this is something that is commonly overlooked as well. And if you are experiencing near misses or falls, it's really important that you know how to get up off the floor. And it might be that you require a piece of furniture. It might be that you've just never practiced it. And so unnecessarily, if you do have an incident, you're on the floor for a lot longer than you need to be. Not only does this give you a lot of confidence, it gives you the skills to get up, and it's really great strength training. If you can lever yourself up off the floor, that's a fantastic start, because you have to use a lot of those big leg muscles in order to do that. So that would be a really good start as well. I just wanted to throw this in here because it's really important as well. In terms of endurance, we would often do what we call a timed 6-minute walk. And so this is where we would look to see, well, how many meters can you cover in 6 minutes? And we've got some fantastic normative data which we can compare that against. So we might look at your 6-minute timed walk. You're a male, you're in your 60s, for instance, and you can do 350 meters. If we compared that to what the normal average meterage should be, you could see that there'd be over a 200-meter difference. And so that's where we would want to start. We'd say, okay, well, for your age group, we would want to see that you can do over 550 meters. So we're going to work on increasing your endurance, your distance, your capacity to do that. Have you got a coffee shop at home that you're aiming to walk to? How far is that? Let's see if that's the goal, for instance. So we would do a 6-minute timed walk, because it's a measure of your endurance and your fitness. And also it's very, very functional. We would also often look at your walking speed. And what you can see here in a quite confusing graph is Middleton and colleagues have put together what walking speed often correlates with. And we know that the slower your walking speed, the more likely you are that you'll need hospitalization, and the more likely you will have concurrent medical conditions going on. So again, it's really important that we can get you into peak physical condition, both from a strength and an endurance perspective, as well as from a cognitive perspective, so that we can mitigate as many of these concurrent medical conditions as possible. So we want you walking at a sufficient speed to be able to cross a set of traffic lights before the lights go red. That's kind of a really good starting point. And if you're struggling to do that, that's when I would suggest you need to see somebody so that we can help you and provide strategies and mechanisms to make sure that you're walking at a sufficient speed. To do that, you might need some walking aids, and there's lots of technology out on the market. At the moment, there's a couple of different devices, sensory socks. So you pop them on, and if they sense that you're starting to freeze, they can vibrate to give you extra proprioception, triggers for weight shift, and can help you with your freezing of gait. There's lots of different walking frames, etc. And this is always a sensitive moment. I can appreciate when people have been walking independently and then feel like, well, I might actually need a device, or it might be proposed to an individual that they might need a device in order to stay effective and safe. And that can be a really defining moment, and I can certainly appreciate that. Certainly from a physio perspective, if I can keep you up on your feet and moving as much as possible, that far outweighs having to use a device. But yes, there's definitely the aesthetics of it. But, you know, there's devices on the market here, if you can see the top right, like the U-Step Walker, which are just fantastic if you tend to have your center of gravity run away with you in front of you. They've got reverse brakes, resistance on the wheels. You can carry a few bits and bobs. You can have a laser light that comes on. So there's lots of different devices that can keep you moving as much as possible. I talked about the Agilitas, which is just where that person's pressing a button. That again is a laser light that comes on when needed. And then there's laser cane. So there's lots of different things out on the market, but they do need to be tested, trialed, and then to develop the skills to use them effectively. In some instances, walking frames can actually be more of a hindrance than a help. And so it's really important that we can address that before it becomes an additional falls hazard. And finally, I've not got too many slides to go, just in terms of cognitive training. I mentioned before, you know, if there's executive dysfunction or there's something going on in how you process information, that can have a really big knock-on effect in terms of falls and just your progress through rehab, etc. And so, you know, we'll often have people come in who say, look, my memory's not very good. And that could be entirely valid, but often what we need to explore, and this is probably more in the domain of our OT colleagues, is they would actually look at, well, are you able to sustain concentration? Are you able to stay on the same task? Do you get easily distracted? You know, these are the things that often mean you're actually not able to attend and your attention is where the problem might be. And this is the bottom of this hierarchy pyramid, because if you can't attend to a task, you can't put that information down and store it for when you need it, and in which case you can't retrieve it, which is often why people think their memory's impaired, but it's actually the inability to concentrate that is probably more the problem. And the good news is that we can help you with that, but we need to be able to identify that first. And so, if you're thinking now, just reflect on can you follow a storyline on the TV? Can you read a book? If you're out to lunch with your friends, can you follow the conversation? If any of those are difficult for you, it might be that you've got difficulty concentrating, and it's the attention that needs to be worked on. Some people might say, I bump into walls, or I'm a bit clumsy. I tripped when I stepped up the gutter the other day. That might be visual processing. And so how you process that information of visual field around you can be impaired. And that's something that you can work on as well. And really important, because we don't want you tripping on gutters or stairs or uneven footpaths and all those things, because the depth perception or the information processing of your visual field is impaired. Information processing, if you get really tired during the day, somebody's asked you something, but it's quite hard for you to respond in a timely fashion, difficult to be really concise, these might be indications of information processing issues. And again, areas that we can help you with if it can be addressed. There might well be memory problems, and this is, where we might look at compensatory techniques. There's a reason why tab timers were invented, because it just takes that off your mental load. You don't need to think about your medications. Your little thing's going to beep and it's all there contained, ready for you to go. You don't have to be thinking about all these sorts of things. So that might be one strategy for you as well. And finally, executive function. I've talked about the set shifting component, but it might also be around problem solving or your insight or prioritization. Sometimes it might be spouses that comment on that more so than the individual with Parkinson's. So again, all of these areas are areas that can be improved and can certainly have a considerable impact on how you respond to rehab and therapy. So I'm going to end that there. I just wanted to do a bit of a plug. Hope this is okay, Stacey. We have a conference coming up on the 11th to the 13th of April. We run it every year. This will be our 8th year. Parkinson's New South Wales is a beneficiary, and we've raised over $215,000 over the last 8 years for our global charity partners. So we'd encourage you to come along. It's free if you want access for 24 hours, or you can upgrade. But there's brilliant content, world-class speakers. So if you're not familiar with Insight, can I please encourage you to come and join us? And this will come after the Parkinson's New South Wales Symposium, which I think is on the 3rd of April from memory.